So, dear guests, dear speakers, Your Excellency, my name is Sarah Ribbett. I'm from the Heinrich-Böll Foundation, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all to this event here. We have seen that New Zealand and the European Union signed a new, very ambitious and progressive free trade agreement on July the 9th. And it will most likely enter into force in the coming months after the European Parliament has given its consent and New Zealand ratified the agreement. And together with the Embassy of New Zealand in Berlin, we took this opportunity to host this panel discussion today to look deeper into the agreement and if it can serve as a role model for embedding sustainability in future trade policy. So today, firstly, we will hear an opening message by His Excellency Craig Hogg, New Zealand's ambassador to Germany. Then afterwards, we will have Elise Tipping, who is New Zealander herself and worked at the International Institute for Sustainable Development, and she will be giving a short introduction into the topic of sustainability in trade policy. This will then be followed by a panel discussion moderated by Petra Pinzler, political correspondent in Berlin for Die Zeit. We are also very pleased to welcome our distinguished panel, which includes Bettina Müller from PowerShift, Dr. Nicolas Kessels from the Federation of German Industries, BDI, and Oliver Knorrich from the German Federal Foreign Office, and Alice Tipping, of course. And we look very much forward to a lively discussion and invite all our panelists, but also the audience, to continue the discussion afterwards in the receptions where we will be served some canapé and New Zealand wine. This said, I would also like to thank all the people that were involved in the organization, especially Christina Rode from the Heinrich-Böll Foundation and Nathalie Hansleben from the New Zealand Embassy. We are also very grateful that Petra Pinzler spontaneously agreed to moderate the discussion, and I'm sure she will be doing an excellent job. Last but not least, I would also like to thank all the people that are doing the catering and organizing the technical stuff in the background and making possible that this event runs smoothly. And without further ado, I will now pass to the ambassador, Mr. Craig Hogg, who is ambassador to Germany, Switzerland, and the Czech Republic and Liechtenstein. He is a senior New Zealand diplomat with experience across foreign affairs, trade, and development policy. Over to you.
Thank you, Sarah. Ina mana, ina reo, ina iwi, I rā rangatira mā, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. I greet you in Maori, which is basically a warmest welcome from us in New Zealand. Can I just acknowledge Petra Pinzler, the Heinrich-Böll Foundation. Thank you very much for hosting us and putting this on. Our esteemed expert panelists, ladies and gentlemen, and a kia ora to all of those who are online tonight. It really is my pleasure to be here tonight to discuss an issue that only grows in importance, but also in debate. As a New Zealander, there is cautious optimism, and I must say some excitement that our trade relationship with the European Union is about to enter a new phase, underpinned by the EU-New Zealand Free Trade Agreement, but more on that later. So tonight, I want to share with you a New Zealand perspective on trade, and I want to highlight three aspects. Firstly, why New Zealand cares about open trade. Secondly, the importance New Zealand places on sustainable and inclusive trade. And thirdly, why we believe that shared sustainability values are what makes the free trade agreement between the EU and New Zealand so unique. So why does New Zealand care about open trade? So you'll all be, I hope, familiar with the world's geography, and New Zealand is not close to Europe. Interestingly, in many European maps, New Zealand usually appears at the way bottom right-hand corner, and on some maps we've fallen off and we're not there at all. So this means we're a long way from Europe, and indeed we're a long way from many countries. So we're an island and we're isolated, but that makes us need to be outward-looking, globally connected for ideas, for innovation, for resources and technology. That's what's important to us. And so New Zealand's prosperity relies ultimately on trading with others. And a previous Prime Minister said, John Key used to say, we won't get rich by selling things to ourselves. And we export about 80% of the food that we grow in New Zealand. So lifting our standards of living requires strong and enduring global trade, and importantly, fair international trading rules. And we're not asking for preferential treatment, but broadly a level playing field. So New Zealand has therefore always been at the forefront of pushing for innovative global trade rules and architecture. For example, the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, which now covers 14.5% of global GDP, is an example of this. So as a country, we see trade as a force for good. Even with recent inflation and the rapid rise of the cost of living, over the long term, New Zealand's open trade has significantly helped to lower the cost of living in New Zealand. And my ministry, the New Zealand Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade, has recently conducted research that found that New Zealand exporting firms tend to be more productive and their employees enjoy higher incomes than non-exporting equivalents. It also found that women employed in goods exporting firms earn on average 10% more than women in non-exporting firms. But despite this, we have seen over the last decade a shifting consensus on the role and the value of global trade to poverty reduction efforts, well-being and prosperity, both in New Zealand and further abroad. And so we call this the social license to trade. This has come under threat as populations have questioned whether the current trade rules are impacting positively on well-being, whether they are exacerbating the impacts of climate change, creating inequalities, or impacting on labour standards. So that leads me on to the second point, and this is the importance that we place on sustainable and inclusive trade. So New Zealand's trade policy is firmly focused on a trade for all agenda. And at the heart of this, therefore, is meaningful trade access and a fair trading platform. And we call this value. But we're also focused on trade that is sustainable and inclusive. And we call this values. So our trade is about value and it's about values. Specifically, New Zealand and the wider region, the Pacific, are already being affected by the impacts of climate change. While we understand and continue to deliver on our domestic climate ambition, we are aware of the extent to which we are impacted by the economic choices of others. Therefore, it has never been more important for like-minded partners like New Zealand and Germany to come together to sustain and strengthen the international rules-based system on which our future prosperity and security depend. It is no surprise, then, that New Zealand has been at the forefront of advocating for inclusive and sustainable outcomes in our trade policy, including climate and environment issues, for more than a decade. New Zealand is part of several initiatives linking trade and sustainability, such as the Agreement on Climate Change, Trade and Sustainability, and the Coalition of Trade Ministers on Climate. We also are a strong advocate of fossil fuel subsidy reform, and for many years championing the agreement on fisheries subsidies last year, which was adopted last year in the WTO. These are all about sustainable trade and trade making a contribution to planetary objectives. In order to meet our inclusive trade agenda, we raise issues such as gender and trade, Maori indigenous issues, and labour standards. And these are now components and considerations in our trade discussions. And today I'll argue that the New Zealand-EU Free Trade Agreement, recently signed and now awaiting approval by the EU and New Zealand parliaments, is a vivid example of a contemporary trade deal which not only offers meaningful new trade opportunities, but which also aims to drive more sustainable and inclusive trade outcomes. So on to the Free Trade Agreement, and I want to just outline why I think the shared sustainability values make this agreement unique. This FTA has enjoyed strong support in the EU to date, culminating in the unanimous approval in the Council of the EU Ministers prior to its signature. The greenest ever, and a model for the EU's FTAs are some of the comments we have heard from our European colleagues, as we have discussed with them the high quality and ambitious agreement. And this high quality FTA breaks new ground and sets new precedents in international trade rules. And it does come at times, as I said, that there's protectionist voices on the rise in trade, questioning the essence of trade. This, coupled with the uncertainties we face geopolitically, speak to the heart of the agreement. It is an agreement that reflects value and values. So on value, it offers new opportunities for exporters both in the EU and in New Zealand. Both sides will benefit from tariff reductions. The FTA is estimated to increase New Zealand exports to the EU by up to €1 billion once it's fully implemented. And for the EU, the Sustainability Impact Assessment commissioned by the European Commission concluded that the absolute gains would be even greater for the European Union, between 1.8 and 3.9 billion once fully implemented. New Zealand is a small, but it's an affluent market and one that has a growing demand for EU goods and services and productive investment. The FTA will cut tens of millions of euros per year in tariffs on a range of European exports to New Zealand, such as footwear and carpet, apparel, cosmetics, chocolate, machinery, and various other products. And there are new opportunities for European business and government procurement, and also raising the investment screening threshold and doubling that. But as I've argued today, we're aware that this new market access is not the only reason for the strong support towards seeking this agreement. Rather, it's the ground-breaking nature of the agreement. The FTA is one of the most ambitious and progressive trade deals on sustainability. As such, it has a dynamic signalling effect. Trade can be a catalyst for positive economic transformation, and we believe this agreement will be able to make an enduring contribution to our respective green transitions. So, important numbers aside, let me stress again, this FTA is also for us about values. This includes the inclusive and sustainability aspects, and let me highlight a few of these. The Trade and Sustainability Development chapter has ambitious outcomes on climate action that have never been included in an FTA before, including the possibility to apply trade sanctions for material breaches of the Paris Agreement. This obligation is important because it underlines our shared commitment both to address in a serious way the most comprehensive global challenges that we face. This chapter also includes important articles on biodiversity, sustainable forestry, responsible business conduct and supply chain management, sustainable management of fisheries and aquaculture, and the most forward-leaning outcomes on fisheries subsidies and fossil fuel subsidies that the EU has agreed to in an FTA. But sustainability goes further than just environmental concerns. The agreement has binding commitments on International Labour Organization fundamental principles on labour obligations. The FTA also contains the strongest outcome ever secured in a New Zealand or EU FTA on trade and gender, with a commitment to uphold the UN conventions related to addressing gender equality and women's rights. This is an important outcome for both parties, recognising the need for trade to help facilitate and build an agenda for ensuring gender equality in trade. Finally, I want to mention an area very important for New Zealand, and that was indigenous issues. And the agreement protecting and promoting indigenous issues, Maori issues in this FTA was a priority for New Zealand in the negotiations. And there is accordingly agreement contains a Maori trade and economic cooperation chapter to advance engagement of trade and investment cooperation activities. And the chapter identifies a number of cooperation areas to enhance the ability of Maori to access the benefits of the FTA, develop business linkages between Maori and the EU small and medium enterprises, and with a particular focus to strengthen science, research and innovation connections. So New Zealand is proud to be the EU's first partner to have concluded an FTA after the EU's Trade and Sustainable Development Review. Looking through the agreement, it is clear that the New Zealand-EU FTA has set a bold precedent for sustainability issues in future FTA negotiations. So it seems appropriate that we are here tonight at the Heinrich-Böll Foundation to discuss the EU's greenest FTA. And I look forward, as I'm sure all of you do, to hear more about what makes this agreement unique and groundbreaking, to look ahead at the future of trade policy more broadly, and how we shape international trade to achieve our sustainability goals. So we're nearly there, but there's a few final steps for us to make sure that we prepare for the ratification and the agreement entering into force, which we hope will be in early 2024. And it's really up to both the EU and New Zealand to take advantage of the opportunities that the FTA offers, both on value and on values. So I thank you all for the opportunity to talk trade, sustainability and inclusivity this evening. Like for New Zealand, these are a powerful combination that puts people and planet at the heart of New Zealand's trade policy. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Good evening, everyone. And thank you very much, Ambassador Hawke, for that rousing, supportive statement for this FTA. My name's Alice Tipping. As announced, I am a New Zealander, but for full disclosure, I'm not here speaking on behalf of the New Zealand government. That was the ambassador's job. But thank you very much indeed to the Embassy and to the Heinrich-Böll Foundation for inviting me to say a few introductory remarks, I guess, about the trade and sustainability debate as it's happening in the global stage. My organisation, the International Institute for Sustainable Development, has followed trade policy, investment policy, energy and water and mining policy for many, many years. And it's always interesting to see an agreement like this one move the ball forward, if I can use a rugby analogy. So the organisers have asked me to talk about what's on the agenda for trade and sustainable development. And the reality is that agenda is a hugely vibrant one. Like the number of topics on the agenda and the depth with which they're discussed is expanding constantly. So all I can give you is a sort of a landscape survey of the kinds of topics that are on the agenda and the nature of the debate under each of them. I'll do that because you will hear a lot of these topics coming up in the panel's discussion of the FTA. And so what I'll do is I'll work through some of those topics and then I'll bring in a little bit what the role of free trade agreements is and then perhaps have a neat segue to our discussion of this particular FTA. So what's on the trade and sustainable development agenda? Top of the agenda, you won't be surprised, is climate change, in a way that it really wasn't even 5 years ago. And what's interesting is that the discussion on trade and sustainable development used to be really limited to the liberalisation of environmental goods and services and some discussion about how multilateral environment agreements related to WTO rules. It is now much, much, much broader than that, right? So a lot of the focus used to be on environmental goods and services. Now it's much more about creating incentives to green or decarbonise supply chains. And what's interesting is that in the absence of a general agreement about the relationship between trade and climate change, many governments are moving towards their own unilateral trade measures, right? As governments implement their own carbon pricing policies and as carbon prices rise, the trade implications become clear and governments are having to manage, on a largely unilateral basis, the implications of their domestic climate change measures. And that's where border carbon adjustment measures like the EU's come in. So trade and trade policy is also becoming much more present than it has been for the last 10 years in discussions about pollution control, including on plastics. So discussion about trade policy is now an important part of discussions at the World Trade Organization, where there's a whole initiative discussing plastic pollution, including discussions of bans and restrictions, circularity and labelling. But also increasingly, there are trade elements coming up in the United Nations discussions on a legally binding instrument on plastic pollution. So trade as a means of controlling and addressing pollution problems is coming to the fore again. Trade and the relationship and our use of natural resources has been an issue for a very long time in many trade agreements. But what's interesting, I think, is that the focus in trade policy has been for the last few years on closing markets to illegally sourced fish products or illegally sourced forestry products. But that debate is evolving. It's now not just about closing markets to illegally sourced products. It's a debate about using trade restrictions to impose requirements of sustainability onto imports, which of course raises the interesting question of sustainability according to whom. There's a big issue linked to climate change around critical raw materials, right? Huge issue in the international trade space as countries are seeking to build their own renewable industries, batteries, wind turbines, solar panels, electric vehicles, and are essentially scrambling to secure access to the minerals they need to build those batteries, whether it be cobalt from the center of Africa or lithium from the Atacama Desert. And many countries are using trade agreements or rapid trade agreements in the form of MOUs to try and secure that access. So climate change, pollution control, natural resources, transition minerals, but there are also some sort of older-fashioned issues that are coming back into the trade discussion with a new tinge, I'd say. Agriculture, right? A central issue in this agreement, which is logical given New Zealand's very agricultural economy. But interestingly, FTAs are no longer just looking at market access questions around agriculture. They're starting to look at the sustainability of commodities that are traded between the two parties. And so there's interesting examples, and I'll get to one at the end, about how trade agreements are being used to try and shape markets and limit and restrict them to sustainably produced goods. There are some issues that are coming up in lots of different forms, in a sort of cross-cutting way. And subsidies is probably top of that list. The ambassadors talked about fossil fuel subsidies and fisheries subsidies. Agricultural subsidies as well is coming up in an environmental context in the World Trade Organization. And what's interesting is that we see similar lessons in the reform of many of these subsidies, right? Fossil fuel subsidy reform, fisheries subsidy reform, agricultural subsidy reform. And so we see some FTAs moving the ball a little bit further forward on each of these issues, and I'll come back to that with an interesting example at the end. So there are a slew of environmentally focused topics on the trade and sustainable development agenda, but of course the other side of sustainable development is social development. And this, I have to say, is an issue that's far, far less developed in the trade policy context, essentially because, my personal opinion, it's even more politically sensitive than environmental issues for all governments. There's some discussion of trade and gender in the multilateral context, some provisions on trade and gender in trade agreements. Much of the discussion, at least at the multilateral level, is limited to the sort of easier topics, supporting women as entrepreneurs. But what is interesting, I think, is when trade agreements start to venture into some of the more structural factors that impede women's participation in economies and participation in societies. Many of the agreements, including the United States, and many including the EU, include trade and labour chapters, like this one. In the case of the US agreements, these are often enforceable through dispute settlement, and many contain, as this one does, commitments to uphold fundamental ILO conventions and commitments to cooperate to improve the engagement of traditionally marginalised social groups. But what I think is interesting in the trade and gender and trade and social issues debate is that the frame of the vulnerable groups we want to support is actually evolving as well. It started with women, and women are still central to it, but the frame is also expanding to include young people, indigenous people, a key priority for New Zealand. So there's a huge range of issues on the trade and sustainable development agenda, far more than there were 5 or even 10 years ago. So where do trade agreements really come into all of this? Trade agreements are essentially a bit like test tubes, right? They are an opportunity for governments to experiment with an idea, to experiment with a set of provisions, to see whether they can craft a new kind of commitment or a new kind of approach, and see if they can move the discussion forward. And this isn't just a theoretical PhD thesis topic, it actually does happen, and I'll give you 1 or 2 very good examples. One is fisheries subsidies. So fisheries subsidies came up on the multilateral trade agenda in 2001. Not a lot happened for 6 years, but the first text tabled in the World Trade Organization negotiations on that topic included 2 ideas: prohibiting subsidies to illegal fishing and prohibiting subsidies where fish stocks were already depleted. That was 2007. Not a lot happened until parties to the Trans-Pacific, or CPTPP agreement, were looking for another way of advancing their sustainability agenda. And they picked up those 2 ideas from the WTO text and put them into their treaty, developed them, solidified them, and turned them into legally binding commitments. Meanwhile, not a lot was happening at the WTO. But once the CPTPP and the SDG frameworks were agreed, and discussion at the WTO started to get more momentum, they looked back to the CPTPP, and I think were strongly inspired by those 2 provisions. And those 2 provisions are now at the centre of the agreement on fisheries subsidies that was agreed at the WTO last year. So FTAs really do serve to move discussion forward and move agendas forward. The question, I think, for this panel is how well does this particular FTA move these ideas forward? The ambassador's mentioned the range of topics it covers. It's covered most of the topics on my list. And I think it'll be an interesting discussion to see from a range of panelists of different perspectives how far this agreement moves us forward. Have we used this agreement as a real test tube to move ideas and to move approaches forward? So with that, it's my pleasure perhaps to give the floor to you, Petra, to moderate the next part of this event. Go ahead.
So, Alice, first of all, thank you to the ambassador for this great introduction, and thanks to you as well for actually asking the question of this panel. How much have we, and also breaking it down to several topics, because moving something forward really needs to have thinking about what needs to be moved forward. And I think some of the topics you mentioned, there were probably, there was a lot of, when we think 10 years back, lots of people would not have agreed to you that these topics should be included in trade agreements. I remember at the university, I learned that trade is about trade and about nothing else. So we have come quite a way, I would say. But to kick off the debate, let me briefly introduce you again so that everybody knows who everybody is, because you don't have name tags here. We have Alice Tippings at the end. Then we have Oliver Knurich, from the Foreign Office. Then we have Nicolas Kessels from the BDI, the German, how would you translate it? The German Business and Industries Association, I would say. And then we have here next to me Bettina Müller from PowerShift, which is an NGO that have been following trade for about 20 years, I would say, quite a while. Not yet 20, so you're still ahead. Your celebration party is still ahead. Alice, the one question you ask, when it boils down to the single phrase is this: what makes this thing exceptional? And if you had the chance to answer it with one sentence, what is it? Is it possible to answer this with one word, one sentence, one very brief statement?
I will try. I think what does make this agreement exceptional is the breadth of issues of sustainable development that it covers, right? Virtually all of the issues that are in discussion at the multilateral level and in general policy discussion about the intersections between trade and sustainability are covered in this agreement. So it has a huge advantage of breadth.
Okay. Who wants to go second? As a brief opening statement, go ahead.
I think what is new to me, who's been in trade and political economics his entire life, professional life, is what we say about international relations also has become very much true for trade policy. Trade is what states make of it. It is not something solid, it's not something static, and with that said, I would also insist it's not something that is now solved, because we would all agree trade, and free trade especially, has externalities that are literally backbreaking at times from a social perspective, but they also endanger our very existence. So that is something that we need to tackle. I like very much, Alice, that you said, okay, this one is actually, it's a stepping stone. It's not a stumbling block, right? That's the discussion we had 10 years ago. We need the great reform. So what is new to me is the political creativity that went into it in actually addressing those issues. Oftentimes, as we've seen with the United States right now, solutions are meant to be easy, or easily digestible, at worst for consumption in social media. But here we see an agreement that also on the operational level has been very energetic. One example, and with that I'll close, for economic operators, it is now possible to certify origin by themselves, which is something that the EU always wanted to do. It never quite worked. It was a super weird process that actually kept economic operators and businesses from joining the privileges that come with free trade agreements. And here we see that rules of origin are not just used for, okay, where does it come from? Does it have origin? Is it part of the free trade area? No, they are actually used as an instrument to say, this is a good that we want to trade, and these are goods that we will not certify, and ergo, they will not be traded with the privileges that we accord to them within the FTA. And that is a huge leap forward.
I tried to find an example for that, and I found Lübecker Marzipan as one of the things that will be traded. Is this true? You don't know. It's too specific.
The Federation of German Industries is not into Lübecker Marzipan.
Okay.
While I personally am a huge fan. But what I'm trying to say is if we have trade in goods that makes sense not only in terms of do I get richer, because this is not the only question that we're asking here. The question that we're asking here is what does it mean for prosperity? What does it mean for diversification away from China? Because, right, that's the context. It also means, does it safeguard our very existence in terms of the climate crisis, biodiversity? Do we keep our commitments? And that is something where you see the political goal, I will close, I promise, the political goal align from the meta through the meso to the micro area with the rules of origin, where economic operators cannot just say, okay, I will sell this because I can sell this. But I have certain standards that I have to meet. And without that, that won't go.
Let's move on. Mr. Knurich.
Should I?
You're one thing that you think makes this thing exceptional. We go into the specifics.
Can I name two?
You can name two if they're short.
Okay, very short. The two things I would like to mention. I think this is a good agreement. It comes at the right time. It comes at a specific moment, and it's a moment where we need all the friends we can get. It's firstly, I think it's a good agreement, and we've touched up. We heard a lot of the issues. Why I think it's an important step in the right direction. You mentioned that 10, 20 years ago, trade agreements were about trade, and now the ambassador has mentioned all the issues which are included in this agreement to address all the externalities you have mentioned, which are part of trade agreements, but this agreement tries to tackle these issues in the agreement. So I think it's the most modern modern agreement of its kind. And yes, I mean it is some kind of a gold standard. It is some kind of a role model for others. And the second point, we can go more into detail. I think it is extremely important that we use these agreements to deepen our relations with a partner like New Zealand, with whom we share so many values, to tackle all the global challenges we are facing, from climate change to standard setting to dealing with authoritarian regimes. There are not so many countries out there anymore with whom we share values, and if we can't agree a trade agreement with a partner like New Zealand, with whom could we?
It's interesting that you're arguing it's not just about the content, it's also about the timing and the partner that we are kind of getting closer with at the same time. Bettina Müller, is there still a reason for PowerShift to be there and to debate these things? Because one of the reasons of your existence is to criticize trade policies. So before you go into criticizing this thing, is there something in there that you like?
Just to maybe clarify, we're not here to criticize. We're here to follow critically and evaluate if there is something to be critical about. And when looking at this agreement, the answer is yes. And I understand we'll go more into detail about our criticism. And when looking at the positive things, I mean, many have been said here, which in part I would subscribe. And let's say in comparison to the other agreements of the European Union, the ones having been signed, the ones that are still under negotiations or which have been adopted and are also close to ratification, it is the greenest, which doesn't make it green.
Okay.
Or very progressive.
And when you argue it's the greenest, you would compare it to all the others the EU has been doing, or to all the others in the world?
No, the European. I'm looking at the European. I'm working on EU trade agreements, so I'm only looking at EU agreements.
I mean, there still is something that it's greener than all the others that we're having.
Oh yeah, but I mean, if you're in a bad marriage, or if you have signed a bad marriage contract, then I mean, yeah, you could always go for worse. But it still makes it a bad contract. I don't know.
And you would actually argue it's a bad contract. So why?
It doesn't live up to the expectations or to what the EU is selling, of this agreement. So there has been a lot of celebrating this agreement, a lot of being the new gold standard, the greenest, yes, let's give it that, agreement the EU has signed so far. But if you look, and devil's always in the detail, right? If you look into the details of this agreement, it is actually not very different from other agreements. Yes, it has new chapter or new articles on gender. It has the one on food and sustainability, sustainable food systems, on Maoris, which is great, but it is mainly aspirational language. So it is something, you know, they might eventually work on. But if we look about what is happening in other agreements where there's also this aspirational language, because the EU has signed these kind of agreements, not much is going on in that sense. So really, and they could have moved forward to really putting more binding language in it, really setting up roadmaps with specified aims they want to reach together, and they're not doing it. So the question is, why are they not doing it? You know.
At least one of the arguments about trade policies and politics always was things have to be binding to really make a difference. So when people start reading trade agreements, there are lots of language in there, especially at the preface, what they are about, how nice they are. But when push comes to shove, it's about what can we enforce. What would you answer to what we just heard about the enforceable parts of this trade agreement when it comes to sustainability, to forests, to labor rights?
I'm a lawyer, so I would love this question. You know, I think it's interesting to see this agreement in the context of the EU's agreements, in which we have better experts than me on the panel, but also in the context of the kinds of agreements that other governments sign, right? So agreements like the CPTPP, including the United States, traditionally have a whole set of very strong obligations, legally binding, enforceable through dispute settlement. Agreements, including the EU, tend to take a more cooperative approach, and it's really a question of how governments think they can best advance these outcomes. And it's simply a question of whether you want to take a very contractual, litigious enforcement approach, or whether you want to take a softer cooperative approach and get to the same outcome that way. And I think while lawyers will tend to kind of instinctively prefer a very sort of contractual, litigious, enforceable approach, it's what has made WTO agreements so interesting from a legal perspective, but I have to say also, so it is what has made them so difficult to negotiate, is that at the end of non-compliance with an agreement, you have legally binding sort of commercial enforcement. So I think, you know, it's a question of how governments think they want to get to their final objective. And at least from what we see, some of the agreements that the United States has signed, it has actually proven quite difficult to enforce and to get to commercial level enforcement of their contractual legally binding provisions. That's not to say it's not the best approach, but it has proven, I think, more difficult than many of us were anticipating to use that approach to get to outcomes. Does that make a cooperative approach better? I don't know. It depends on whether the cooperation happens and how well it happens to get to an outcome.
Anybody wants to join in?
Yes.
Okay, that's a quick answer, so we can move on.
No, I would just throw something domestic in here, because what we see in the European Union with the deforestation regulation that's been in force since June, the forced labor ban, which BDI is actually a huge fan of, really, because there's so much in there that we really like, especially in terms of digitalization of compliance processes. We have CBAM, you mentioned it before. The taxonomy obviously plays a role. So there are mechanisms in place, and they are taking shape recently that make this a cooperative approach with teeth domestic. We have to see where this goes, and I completely agree. This is the greenest yet, but we can't stop here. If we are real about trade, if we are serious about trade and what it means, about the geopolitical significance that this has due to economic coercion, Lithuania, anybody? Because that was a very difficult pickle we found ourselves in as European Union. Then we need to do better. So this is a chance to do better.
But let me just interrupt you. When you mean we need to do better, so you would actually agree with Bettina Müller that we need to have stronger language when it comes to, for example, sustainability?
No.
That would be a surprise.
Actually, and I do you one better. So I like the cooperative approach with teeth at home, but what I also would put out there is a question. Europe spends 70 million billion euros each year on development assistance. If you trust the OECD numbers, that's actually 88 million in ODA.
But let's stick a bit to the topic.
No, that is the topic. Because if we go somewhere else, to less developed countries.
But New Zealand is not a less developed country.
No, somewhere else, and we want to do better. Then my question would be, why don't we spend that money in actually realizing sustainability goals, ESG goals, with money that we are already spending, very diverse, not focused, and we are actually wasting time and energy, which we should be putting into those agreements becoming better. Because what the ambassador said is true. It's a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, yes. It's a very specific case, and there is so much more market out there.
But just to get this clear, you would argue we don't need strong language in agreements like this one because we need to focus on other countries where the problems are much bigger. Is this the way you would actually argue?
That is not what I'm arguing. What I'm arguing is look at CBAM, look at the deforestation regulation, look at the forced labor ban. If you want strong language, you'll find it there because they close off the market to goods that do not apply.
Okay.
But if you then go ahead and say, okay, but we need more free trade with other regions, then actually the European Union has to find a way, with all the money that it spends, decentrally, to give poorer countries a leg up, and they're not doing that right now. And that will mean that what we want to see, the development further, FTAs, this one in particular, being a stepping stone and not a stumbling block.
Okay, let's stop there. Oliver Knurich.
Maybe just to add on this whole question of enforceability, trade sanctions, and so on. I would warn against, getting to the conclusion that the trade sanctions which are included in this agreement are kind of the silver bullet to solving all the sustainability issues. In this agreement, yes, it's basically including the suggestion by the European Commission, and yes, it has a strong enforceability. But there's no one-size-fits-all. What we can agree with New Zealand mutually will not work with other countries, with other regions, and I think we need to look also at other instruments, at other tools, how to better, what's the word, not enforce, better implement the sustainability goals we are trying to achieve. And sometimes a cooperative approach might be better, might work better. Sometimes incentives, different tools, different sets of incentives might work better. Sometimes dialogue mechanisms might work where a confrontational or approach with a strong enforceability might not be possible. So I'd argue there's no one size fits all, and we have to look at each individual case and at a wide range of tools and instruments.
Bettina Müller, one could argue, even though this might not be 100% perfect, it's better than the things that the EU has done before. But one could probably, or could one in addition argue that maybe we don't need enforceable rules with a country like New Zealand because it's so much alike us that you don't need to include this in trade agreements?
Maybe you got me wrong here. I was not only talking about sanctions when I was talking about fully implementing sustainability aspects and fully taking into account these aspects. And sustainability is about more than only environmental sustainability. It's about social sustainability, what the ambassador was also mentioning. And what we're always looking at PowerShift is how sustainability aspects are actually an integral part of an entire agreement. And when I look at the EU-New Zealand agreement under this aspect and this perspective, perspective, then actually it falls very short even of the policies the EU, of the own goals the EU has been setting via its European Green Deal. You know, I mean, it wants to reduce its GHG emissions until 2030 by 55%. If we want to do that, we have to double the efforts that we have done the last 10 years. I don't know how we want to do that with an agreement that potentially will lead to even more GHG emissions. And an agreement, you were talking about diversification of economies, sorry. This agreement will do nothing to help New Zealand to diversify its economy and actually become an exporter of more industrialized goods. I mean, if we look at the trade balance between the EU and New Zealand, at the moment, New Zealand is exporting agricultural goods and minerals and raw materials. And with this agreement, which is liberalizing 100% of all goods, there is no differentiation between if it's an environmentally good, or if it's climate wrecking and environmentally damaging. So this, for one thing. Then on the other hand, it will most likely lock in the harmful modes of production we are looking at the moment. I mean, again, looking at New Zealand, which is depending a lot on agriculture, which has led to having now 80% of its endemic species being under danger. You know, I mean, we're looking at very different aspects here to which the EU-New Zealand agreement will most likely only contribute in a very negative way. So it's not only, and this because of tariff liberalization and because of a lot of, I mean, we have energy and raw materials chapters. If you want, we can go into detail there because I have been working a bit now on that because it has been included in quite other agreements and how that will actually foster extractivist policies in these countries. So, you know, it's not only enforceable trade sanctions, and I mean, would be nice, but I'm not referring to that when I'm looking at sustainable standards in an agreement and how the EU and New Zealand agreement actually scores when it comes to, you know, being a really green agreement.
The argument you're making is a very important one. You're actually arguing that the trade agreement in itself, no matter what's in the letters, is enforcing and pushing a model of trade and economy that you would argue is not sustainable. Is there anybody who wants to respond to that one? That
obsolete, that's what I would call it.
Okay.
Obsolete and
That's
not
even
in line with the EU, the goals the EU has setting itself with its new sustainable policies.
So that's me then.
It's you.
Yeah, I think she's right.
Okay.
I should think about my arguments here. The VDI is
What's
actually
going on here?
And she's wrong at the same time because, as I said, things are dynamic. They change over time. The things, or the trade that we've conducted in the heyday of neoliberalism, 1990s, greed is good. That time has passed, and that's good. We find ourselves in a transformative time where trade is changing. I'd rather have extractionism, to be honest, in New Zealand than I have, for example, in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. We know that free trade, and this is one of those things that we don't need to agree on. They are a fact of life. Free trade leads to a more efficient appropriation of resources. If we do everything, if everybody does everything, that is not sustainable. That would be a terrible death sentence for our planet. Does that mean that we have time? No, we certainly don't. We should be faster in doing this. Is this economy that we're talking about and its externalities going to look the same in 10 to 20 years? I would also doubt that because what Ms. Miller just said is an extrapolation of today's state of play into the future, 20 to 30 to 50 years. That will not be the case. What we are seeing is in advanced economies are changing from material resource intensive economies into energy intensive economies. And that is something that we need to consider. Does that mean that we shouldn't move forward? And I cannot stress this enough. I do not think that the gold standard is something that we should keep steady in the coming years. That is not what I'm saying here. I'm saying this is good, but it can only be a start. And when I'm saying this, that also includes BDI supporting with its members, which are not companies, but industry associations, by the way, a little bit of association knowledge here, which is something that we support too, because if we want to produce here, we have to meet certain standards. If everybody else is cutting these standards, again, China, we won't be here in 20 years. So I'm just saying, we're difficult partners, but we're partners in this.
It's interesting. I think you made two interesting points. One is that standards are also a competitive advantage for your companies which are based here and which have to oblige to these kind of standards. The second one that I found interesting, and maybe Oliver Knurich, you might comment on that one as well, is that actually it's much better to have extractive industries in New Zealand than to have them in the Congo, because we have certain standards that we don't have in many developing countries.
Well, yes, yes, indeed. I mean, I think we have to be very clear. I think our economic model is transforming, is changing, and I don't think that this trade agreement or any trade agreement is kind of the instrument to determine how our economic model should look like. I think the yardstick should be, can a trade agreement be part of the solution? Can it help? But we don't have to define everything in a trade agreement. First point. Second point, yes, indeed, we need raw materials. We need intermediary products. We need so many things, so many products, so many raw materials for our green transformation, for this transformation of our industry. And if we can forge an ever closer relationship with a partner like New Zealand, of course this is positive. And of course there are many other countries exporting raw materials which are so difficult on a in terms of standards, human rights standards, ecological, climate standards. So I can only agree with Nicolas Kessels here.
We spoke briefly, just to mention that point, before we started this debate. You also mentioned the issue of geopolitics, that it makes sense to trade with friends these days and with the few democracies that we still have in this world. Bettina, you want to react to many of these points, probably. And then we're going to open the floor to the panel.
I think there's an underlying disagreement here on what the current trade model is actually supporting. And you said it is helping with appropriate allocation of goods, and I would say it is fostering path dependencies, which come from historical, from history and which are based on historically created structures. I mean, this is even more clear when we look at former colonies and the way we're trading today still with them, and the trade agreements which will only foster the past dependencies, and the current economic structures and kind of traps they find themselves in. But if I look at this agreement with New Zealand, I don't see how actually New Zealand would come out of this dependency on agricultural production and also minerals extraction. This agreement at least will not help with this. So, and this would also be kind of my response to Mr. Knurich. I think, exactly the question is, will this agreement support us in this transition, in this green and just transition, which leaves no one and no place behind to cite the European Green Deal? And I would say, well, it is a try, maybe, but at least it falls very short of our expectations to what really means a just and green transition. And one part of a just and green transition is to allow a country to really diversify and, you know, just to use it as a supplier of raw materials because we need these raw materials for our green transition. Well, this is not just. So I would strongly vouch for an agreement that really gives, for example, New Zealand the possibilities to have dual pricing so they can allocate the raw materials they extract from their grounds to a better price to their local producers than they do for exporting. That would just be a very little, very slight improvement, something which is now prohibited with this agreement.
Alice, you want to react to what we just did? No? Maybe then I can ask you another question. When you mention all these points and you kind of, in a very brief time period, you showed us how much we have advanced today, how much about how many things we have to think today when we do trade agreements or when people do trade agreements in our names. So who are the ones pushing for that? I mean, is this a success story of NGOs? Have the governments changed and are now more aware of the issues? What has actually made this happen?
It's a good question, and it's, as usual with most of these good questions, it's probably a combination of factors on different topics, right? You know, I think on particular issues like sustainable forestry, biodiversity, fisheries, it's a combination of NGOs and I suspect domestic industries wanting to ensure that imports of timber, imports of fish, imports of, you know, sort of nature-based products are not sourced illegally because that undermines their standards respecting production, and making sure that those imports are not sourced unsustainably, again, because that undermines their standards-dependent production. So I think, you know, it's partly domestic industry and domestic NGOs who put the issue on the political agenda. In some specific multilateral contexts, it's very specifically NGOs allied with countries who wanted particular outcomes in particular multilateral agreements. So I think it's a combination of all of those things. And the ambassador was talking about the social license to trade, right? I think in a number of respects, it's organizations within domestic polities who are requiring sustainability in agreements in order to agree to some liberalization of their own markets. Because otherwise, you know, otherwise it seems like a purely mercantilistic, very efficient allocation of resources, but a purely economic transaction. And my sense is, you know, the general sort of civil society are expecting more of trade policy than just an efficient allocation of resources.
Do you have any insights concerning this trade agreement? I remember I followed CETA and TTIP very closely. That was always the European Commission who didn't really want to go into those issues. It was the Canadian government who wanted to push for it. What about this one? Or do we have to ask the ambassador?
I no longer work for the New Zealand government. I have no idea what went on inside the meeting room, but I will say that when I see New Zealand on the international stage, it is consistently, aggressively progressive in what it wants to achieve in international agreements. I'll leave it at that.
Okay. So maybe at this point we can open the floor to you. If anybody wants to raise a question, have a comment, so just raise your arm. If not, we just keep on debating up here. But maybe, Mr. Ambassador, do you want to? There's a question over there.
Hi, Sophia Paulini. I'm a postdoc at Humboldt University researching trade and sustainability. And in my research, I think about trade agreements as constituting the global economy, sort of building blocks of the global economy. And as such, they are really good instruments to cooperate with partners on the common socio-ecological transformation. And this discussion on whether a cooperative approach is better than an approach based on sanction, I think what is often not in enough focus is the substance of the commitments in the TSD chapters. And if you look at EU new generation agreements, the TSD chapters focus on the domestic law and standards of the parties. So they're trying to kind of establish a sort of common ground of standards when it comes to labor protection and the environment. And I was wondering to whoever would like to address this question, if there's really no potential in future agreements to focus more on the trade that is actually occurring under the agreement and focus on the sustainability of that trade. So similar to what Bettina was suggesting, to push those goods that are sustainable, or at least provide preferential treatment only for those goods that are sustainable. Whatever that means, of course, that has to be defined, and that's very complicated. But
the idea isn't completely new, and the European Union and the United States are right now trying to negotiate TIST, the Trade in Sustainable Goods Trade. That is, unfortunately, not going to become a stepping stone for anything, because the worker-centric trade policy of the United States is a protectionist way of saying we don't want to trade. We want everybody to diversify away from China, but we don't want to enlarge the market with which it would be possible to scale business elsewhere. They want to have, as they say, their cake and eat it too. And this leads me to what I said in the beginning. If we design rules of origin, so who has the passport to actually enjoy the privileges of a free trade area? In the way, as you mentioned, to say, okay, we liberalize aspects of that market, that would be one way to do it. It's difficult because obviously the logic of negotiations always goes into all those areas. You know that probably very well. So there's the domestic side. What does the EU do? The due diligence directive, for example, is interesting, I think, in this regard, because it's not only, I mean, the instruments that I mentioned before, they close off the common market to goods coming in from outside. The due diligence directive now does something else. It manages how economic operators, what they do within the supply chains that they work with. I get that this is a very frustrating incremental answer to a now problem, but I can't do better than that. I'm sorry.
Okay, Alice?
I mean, I just wanted to chip in firstly to say, I think the point you're making about the substance of the obligations is, I think, exactly the point that Bettina was making, and with which I entirely agree. Right? The lawyer got the better of me, and I focused on the sanctions. But in terms of agreements that focus on the actual trade between the parties and how to make it ensure, by some measure, that it's sustainable, the EFTA-Indonesia FTA is a really interesting example there, right? Because it focuses on trade of palm oil from Indonesia into EFTA states and establishes a specific quota, a specific market access tool for palm oil that meets a degree of sustainability, right? Defined, interestingly, with reference to private sustainability standards for palm oil. So it is there. There are some agreements that do specifically that.
Bettina?
Not just the ambassador already mentioned the agreement on climate change, trade and sustainability. New Zealand is currently negotiating with Costa Rica, Fiji, Norway, Switzerland, among others. And I think this is something that maybe the EU should have had a look at a bit more, because it is specifically about trading environmentally good goods, so what they call environmental goods. And I mean, the agreement with New Zealand, the EU agreement, contains an annex of supposedly environmental goods and green goods, but there is nothing in there that says we will only liberalize for these goods, because they liberalize for all goods. So what could have been done is to say, these are the green goods, we liberalize for those. You know, and then the whole thing would have been a bit different, but they decided not to. but they could have. You know, it's not only about multilateral negotiations that are always very difficult. The European Union could have done that already with New Zealand. And I understand, from what I understand from this agreement, that New Zealand is negotiating with other partners, that they would have been open to it. So the question is, why was the EU not?
Is there anybody else who has a question or a comment? Well, we've been so good. Huh? We answered basically everything.
One thing, I want to agree with Bettina Müller again. The one thing that surprised me with regard to this particular agreement was that there's no local production clauses in there. Because if we're real, you know, free trade orthodoxy has changed, right? And we are, as industry federation, but also from what I see in Europe, more acceptant of states saying, like Chile, for example, no, you will not simply extract and then run for the hills, but we need production at home. Now that is something that I would have expected in this agreement, and I was surprised. But again, that is the argument that I'm trying to push here. This can only be a start. If we are real about trade and how important it is, if we honor that thought, that the trade is what we make of it, then trade needs to change. I mean, there was a very good reason why the 2001 WTO session went up literally in flames, because we have not done a very good job of tackling those externalities. I would nevertheless say free trade agreements, therefore, do not cement path dependencies. They can break them. If, for example, we have dual pricing, which I find very difficult because economically there are a lot of difficulties with that there. But if we agree, for example, to core issues of industrial policy, which is something that we're talking about much more about recently, then local production would be one of those things that I think everybody would agree makes sense, would actually enable countries to diversify. But you can't. You can't change with trade policy what domestic policy doesn't deliver. That is something sometimes when listening to what trade agreements should be able to do, a trade agreement cannot override domestic law, and it shouldn't. I mean, the whole debate about dispute settlement was about you should be doing this, now they should. Well, again, make up your mind. You can't have your cake and eat it too. Now with the jurisdictions of New Zealand and the European Union, I'm feeling rather comfortable of saying, okay, we got this. With others, we don't. And that is where we need to spend more time and effort and money that we're already spending, in supporting systems that work better for people and the nature.
Maybe just for the audience that haven't followed these issues for 20 years, could you in 2 sentences explain what ISDS is and the dispute settlement issue and why it was so...
Yeah, 2 seconds. Well, the idea in dispute settlement is that with countries where you can't plausibly go to a court of law because you do not believe in the rule of law applying to you, there is an agreement that there is a mechanism that gives you what you are legally owed to within the confines of the FTA. Is the legal answer to this, which I guess Bettina Müller has a practice.
What's your answer? Can you briefly say it in your words?
I'm sorry, I have been even working long on ISDS than I have on FTAs, sorry, so free trade agreements, so I could not be less in agreement with you on ISDS and the way you framed it. Investor-state dispute settlement is a mechanism that is enshrined in bilateral investment treaties and some investment protection chapters in FTAs. The EU wants to sign new ones now with Chile, with Mexico. New Zealand does not have such a such an investment protection clause.
You know why it doesn't have it? Because New Zealand didn't want it? But
No, New Zealand is not signing these kind of agreements. Good for you. Because it gives foreign investors the right to sue states if these investors think their investment has been harmed by or negatively affected by state regulation, by a decision, for example, even of Supreme Courts, because they can override these kind of decisions, ISDS, like tribunals, and then they can go to these parallel tribunals. The most important one is ACCTS, which is the Center for Dispute Settlement at the World Bank, which is the most used arbitration center. You have a panel there of 3 arbitrators, which are basically lawyers. And then the investor names one arbitrator, the state names one, and then they have the president, and they decide behind closed doors about these cases, which often also may be decisions because of social conflicts related to mines. Actually, most of the ISDS claims today are related to mining. And so, yeah.
So in this regard, this is a good agreement. Because it doesn't have these clauses.
Yes, happy that it doesn't have, because in that sense, you know, I mean, I'm working mainly on FTAs with Latin America, and there's a lot to do there, and I wanted to invite you, now that we all agree on that this is the new gold standard, to all together go to the streets and fight the agreements that are still to come there with Chile, Mexico, and Mercosur, which are nothing in comparison to this agreement. Like, really, in that comparison, this is a good agreement. And but and Mercosur does also, EU-Mercosur does also not have this investment protection chapter, but EU-Mexico and EU-Chile have.
Okay.
Sorry, I'm just getting very emotional with this subject because it's,
It's been a long story. There have been lots of people going to the streets for that issue like 10 years ago when we discussed TTIP, but it seems like ages ago. Mr. Knurich, you wanted to mention something? You wanted to say something? Okay. So, any questions out there? Good, your last chance. If not, I would like to kind of make the point that I found it really, I mean, I've been to a lot of debates on trade a couple of years ago, and they were really heated, much more heated than what we had today. And the BDI would have never agreed with power shift on anything. So in this regard, I would actually argue we've come a long way. Maybe we're not at the end, but when will we ever be at the end of something like that? And what I found secondly interesting is that we spoke a lot about sustainability, rights of indigenous people, forests, and actually nobody mentioned the amount of money that will be made through this trade agreement. Maybe this is because we had the Böll Foundation. Maybe it is because, as you said, the way we look towards trade agreements has really changed. With that closing word, anything to add here? Yeah.
ISDS being of the devil.
Okay, you want to open that door again?
No, I'm not opening that door.
You've got 2 minutes.
I agree with the sentiment, and I would pose the question of what would it mean if we are faced with someone like Jair Bolsonaro, where we, for example, have that kind of legal recourse. It's the instrument, it's not the policy goal. And I think that what has changed in recent years, structurally, in terms of how has the debate been shaped, is 10 years ago, the instrument and the policy goals were the same. Today, I would say that most people appreciate that the political goals that you set and the instrument that are used are 2 different things. And an ISDS can be rather working, and an ISDS can be something that enshrines unfair trade practices. I would agree. But again, trade is what you make of it, and that's our job the next 10 to 20 years.
I would actually suggest we will be having wine and finger food out there, that we continue the debate about ISDS out there, because we could continue here for another 2 hours at least, and this would be heated. Maybe one very final question to you, Oliver Knurich. when I learned what trade is about at the university where I studied economics, trade was not about politics and policies at all. This has definitely changed.
Well, yes, and it's not limited to trade.
Mm-hmm.
I think we've all seen and learned through wars and the pandemic and supply chains and dependencies and Russian energy and gas. There's no clear distinction between foreign policy, geopolitics, trade, economics, geoeconomics. It's there's no fine line anymore. Maybe there never was, but maybe we thought there was. So, and I think you see it in when you open the newspaper. You see it when you see a national security strategy or a China strategy. They are essentially economic strategies, and you see it when you see an industrial strategy published 2 days ago. It's partly a geopolitics strategy. And trade agreements are one instrument. They are one tool in the toolbox, in the geoeconomic toolbox. And that's why we haven't talked about, how many percentages trade will raise and how many jobs will be created or in short, this goes kind of without saying, but that's not the debate anymore. The debate is we have so many conflicts of objectives, geopolitics versus sustainability, or labor versus economics, and it's all part of a much bigger debate, and that's what also makes it so interesting.
That was a great final word. I would say thank you to the panel, thank you to the ambassador, and thanks to you for listening. Have a good evening.